I'm Tim Kaine, and I've worked hard to pass legislation that makes life better for Virginians, like passing laws lowering prescription drug costs, capping the cost of insulin at $35, bringing good-paying jobs into our communities, and helping Black-owned businesses grow. In good times and in tough times, Virginians stand up and stand together. Will you join me? Together, we can keep delivering for Virginia. I'm Tim Kaine, candidate for U.S. Senate, and I approve this message. Paid for by Kaine for Virginia.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, mate. Happy to be back online with you, talking about football with my mates. Best thing to do on an evening.
Yeah, absolutely. And that voice you could hear, guys, is Mr. Gary Thacker. We've done a couple of podcasts previously to talk about some wonderful books of yours. Two of them that I've got on my bed amongst a group of other books about Brazil. But this one, Beautiful Bridesmaids Dressed in Orange and the Dutch Masters, those are two of the books that you've previously written through Pitch Publishing. But I wanted you just to briefly talk to people that don't know or haven't heard the podcast before, your back catalogue of books in these football times and who Gary Thacker is.
Sure, mate, no problem. Yeah, well, as you mentioned, I've been a member of these football times for about, 6 or 7 years now, and worked for the magazines for a long time, and did a lot of podcasts on there. And yeah, I've lived in Spain now for knocking on for 6 years now, and until recently I wrote for a English language Spanish newspaper over here about a weekly column on La Liga. And yeah, I've written the book we're talking about now, the Brazil book, will be my 8th book. I've written a couple of novels, and one about the first one's sort of like a self-published semi-autobiographical thing. I've written a book about England, and then you mentioned the two Dutch books, one about Ajax, one about the Dutch national team, and a book about Chelsea winning the Champions League in 2012, and then this is number 8, which is about the Brazil team in 1970. I only tend to write books about things that I would say that I love, but things that impress me, things I like. And 1970 was, if the Dutch team was the best team never to win the World Cup, 1970 Brazil was the best team to ever win the World Cup.
I think you're absolutely spot on, and we're going to be talking about your book because it's not just about the 1970. Oh, Jogo Bonito. I looked and I thought, what a great name for a book. The cover's fantastic. It's always Pitch and Duncan at Pitch that picks the covers, and the geezer is an absolute genius because he's bought another one out of the bag. It's a beautiful game in Portuguese, isn't it?
It is quite right, man. You're right about Dunk as well. This is my fourth or fifth book with Pitch, and when we talk about the covers, I always say to Dunk, well, I think this and this, but whatever you say comes out best, and he's just, as you say, he's a genius, and the cover is really beautiful. It really represents the vibrancy of the Brazil play and the sunshine and Mexican World Cup. So, yeah, you're quite right, mate. It's a brilliant cover.
And that World Cup, arguably the most colourful World Cup ever, in terms of the vibrant colours of the shirts of the crowd in Mexico, the Azteca Stadium, etc., and colour television, of course, because the last World Cup was pretty much, and previous World Cups, all in black and white. This was the first one that was totally in Technicolor.
You're right, mate. Yeah, it is. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why this World Cup is always sort of remembered so fondly, not only because of the football, but because of the sort of spectacular presentation of it. Because, as you say, it was all in colour, and and the crackly voice as well on the commentary. It was like listening to somebody, Apollo 14 talking from the moon, and it was sort of this whole atmosphere about the World Cup. And there's a little interesting thing about the use of the Telstar ball. If you recall, Paul, and this is the first time they used this World Cup. Well, the Telstar ball, Adidas designed that for black and white television because it would show up better than a white ball on monochrome. And of course, now it's obviously linked with the colour in the World Cup, and forever will be the Telstar ball and the colour of the World Cup. And it was actually designed for black and white television.
And also, as well, it was the invention of TV. We had more coverage in 1970, didn't we? We had, the panels were just getting their acts together, etc. There was a lot of cutting edge stuff going into the 1970 World Cup, and of course, a lot of it was in altitude as well, being there in Mexico, wasn't it?
Absolutely, buddy. There's one of the reasons Brazil did so well is because 2 years before the Olympics were held in Mexico as well, and there's a guy who was scientist in the Brazilian Navy called Da Costa, who did a big study about the effects of altitude on athletes in the Mexico Olympics, and what he learned, he took to the Brazilian CBD, the Football Association, to sort of say how you get the best benefit out of playing at altitude. And his plan was they played at 3 different training camps before going to start the tournament. Each one at a higher altitude. So when they got there, although they were playing in Guadalajara, which is fairly low, the presence of the altitude training in their legs was always there right up to the final. So the altitude is a massive thing, Paul, in the World Cup, and a lot of teams didn't have that same sort of preparation, suffered, and Brazil scored the bulk of their goals in the second half of games because they were just fitter, and the altitude training they did was serving them so well.
And that's the thing, in Central America and South America, we don't, as Europeans, don't understand how vast those countries are and that continent is. And again, how colourful that continent of South America, and colourful in the way that the carnival, Brazil, the samba boys, it was just everything was really waiting to explode, wasn't it, in 70? And it did.
Oh, yeah. Definitely, mate. I mean, it's interesting to say about the size of the countries in South America. The northern part of Brazil is nearer to Canada than it is to the southern part of Brazil. That's how big Brazil is. Yeah. A strange fact to be. But yeah, the colours there, I mean, Brazil obviously in their famous yellow Canary shirt, but Peru as well, in that sort of iconic white shirt with a big red sash, and Uruguay in the sky blues. So there's so much colour. As you say, the South American football, and obviously Mexico as well, playing in the traditional green shirts. So the colour presentation, colour TV, really enhanced the presentation of that tournament and made it probably the most iconic World Cup of all time.
I think so. I think if you look at in the history of football, I think that 1970 World Cup finals was fantastic. And I just want to give a shout out to Andrew Downey, the greatest show on earth, inside story of the legendary 1970 World Cup. So it's all about that World Cup in Andrew's book. And he's also a connoisseur on Brazilian football, isn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was privileged enough to get an interview with Andrew for the book. I quoted him. He's such a nice guy. You sort of say to somebody, can I ask you a few questions? And you send an email off, and he comes back 3 weeks later and one word answers. But Andrew was brilliant, and he gave me so much information. As you say, an absolute doyen of Brazilian football, as well as that the great show on earth. He also wrote the book about Dr. Socrates as well. So yeah, this guy knows his stuff, and great asset to be able to quote in the book as well after the conversation I had with him.
Football philosopher, legend, Socrates, forward by Johan Cruyff. Again, I've got that in my hand. It's in my library. Brazil of 1970, quite unfancied, wasn't they, going into the World Cup? Or they didn't particularly fancy themselves, did they?
No, they didn't. It's been a bit of a chaotic situation because just a couple of months before this tournament started, they sacked the manager, Gel Saldana, but had taken them through the qualification and right up to almost to the start of the preparations for the World Cup. Then he got sacked, and they brought in Zagallo. Literally 2 months, and he wanted to change the system he played. And as you quite rightly say, Paul, they went out there heartily as favourites. And I think it was Rivellino said when they sort of flew from Brazil, a lot of people weren't even expecting to go to the group. Of which when you got a group where you got England in the same group, so you got the last 3 World Cup winners in the same group. It's just a strange situation because it's happening today. But if they slipped up against Romania or the Czechs and then got beat by England, they could have not got out of the group. But obviously that didn't happen, and they did, and they sort of became sort of the wonderful team that they were.
Again, very different in those days. We didn't have seeding systems like we do today to keep the big hitters away. It was just literally the luck of the draw. I look at Brazil in 70 as a team, and you've just alluded to the fact that the manager come on board pretty much a couple of months before the tournament started. A little bit of synergy there with the Dutch team of 1974. They had injuries in the camp, and Rinus Michels, he come into it quite late, didn't he, if memory serves me right?
Yeah, I mean, even later. I mean, basically the qualification was done, and he got there to pick the squad and then to take them to the tournament. But there's a goal I think was a bit different in as much as Saldana was. Well, there's many reasons why people have said he got the sack in the end, but this was Brazil were under a military junta at the time, very right wing military junta. Saldana was a communist. So that didn't help. There's a story about a guy called Dario, who was a forward, was apparently one of Medici was the president at the time, his favourite player, and Saldana wouldn't pick him in the squad to play, and he fell out with lots of people. He's very abrasive, Saldana. So it's a strange situation, to sort of go through the qualification situation and everything going well, and all of a sudden things blow up. And as you say, it's a bit like the Dutch. Just when things are going well, you turn the table over. And, the Brazilians appointed a new coach. I mean, literally 2 months ahead of the tournament started. And he wanted to play a different system. Saldana had played a 4-2-4 system. And Zagallo's system was play 4-2-4 going forward, but he wanted to play a 4-3-3 when they hadn't got the ball. He wanted a left-sided player who could drop back into midfield when they lost possession to sort of solidify the midfield and play a 4-3-3. So he had to get the players in place to do that. And he brought in Rivellino, who he brought in to play that role, because a couple of the wingers he'd got inherited from Saldana couldn't do it. So, and he changed the team a couple of times. It was really weird, and there's a couple of injuries going into the tournament. Costello had a bad eye injury, and he didn't make the tournament, but then sort of got through in the end. Jersey went into the tournament with an injury. It wasn't looking great as you go to the first game, but there you go.
Yeah, my main goal threat, or my second main goal threat, can't score because he's only got one eye and a detached retina. But again, They overcome that. But I guess really, to understand Brazil in 1970, we've got to look at Zagallo, how instrumental he was, because he was a previous World Cup winner with Brazil as a player, and then as a manager he became a first to win as a player and as a manager. But he was a wide player that liked to drop in deep, and he was very pioneering in his play and his role in that Brazilian team, wasn't he?
Dead right, buddy, and this is the role that he wanted to have as a coach. The role that he played in the other Brazil triumphs, when he played as that wide player on the left who would drop back into midfield. And there was a couple of left wingers in the squad from Saldana, which was Paulo Cesar and a young kid called Edu. And he tried them, and they couldn't do it because basically they were wingers. Yeah. Now, Rivellino was actually in that team, and the team in the World Cup that played most of the way through. There were 5 players who had played number 10 for their club teams, and Rivellino was one of them. And he was a midfield player that was playing out of position on the left, rather than playing a winger and asking him to play an unfamiliar place in midfield. So that worked. And he only brought Rivellino in a couple of games before the tournament started. But last couple of preparation games. And he played against Austria in the last game before the tournament started. And this quote I can't remember the exact words, but it's words to the effect of Rivellino knew this was the most important game of his life. And if he could make it play, the system worked. Play on the left going forward, play into midfield when they hadn't got the ball, he would book his place in the World Cup, and that's what he did. Despite the game in a 0-0 draw, he did enough to convince Zagallo that he was the guy to solve the problem. And B, basically, people talk about the false 9. Well, this guy was a false 11, very much as Zagallo was in his playing days, as you mentioned.
But again, fitting all them players into a team, it's something in modern day England, or in any time of England, we struggle to fit flair players into a team. The chances of a Gareth Southgate, for instance, putting 5 number 10s in a team, he would do it extremely well if it was 5 right backs to be put into a team, but 5 number 10s, absolutely no chance. But Zagallo looked at it and thought, those are my players, I'm going to blend them into a team. And almost we can remember all of the forward players of Brazil, and the only defensive player that most people, I'm guessing, me in particular, I can remember, is Carlos Alberto. I can't remember any other defenders.
Well, interestingly, Constable was right back in captain. The guy on the left back was a guy called Everaldo, who also came into the team quite late, and he was the only guy who played the regular selection who wasn't wearing a 1-11 shirt. There's a guy called Marco Antonio who was actually wearing the 6 shirt. Would have been left back, but he got sort of eased out when Everaldo took his place. But of the other two defenders, an interesting story. Brito was a centre.
UMBC's programs in Geographic Information Systems translate to career growth. GIS jobs have increased 98% over the last few years across a variety of industries. At UMBC, you'll go further, getting technical leadership experience as well as advanced knowledge of emerging GIS applications. UMBC brings it all together at the Rockville and Baltimore campuses. Learn more at further.umbc.edu.
Half, and playing alongside him was a guy called Piazza. Now, Piazza was a midfield player for his club, defensive midfield player. But in a training session ahead of the tournament, a couple of defenders got injured, and Zagallo put him back to play there. And what it gave, a bit like Harry Hahn when he was playing into the Dutch team in the 74, ability to go to bring the ball out and also bolster the midfield going forward from the back, as well as Rivellino would do it when they hadn't got the ball, dropping back into midfield. So Piazza was a wonderfully important player in that team, and he sort of was moulded into being a defender, but he was a midfield player.
But again, it goes to the philosophy of the manager. They got players, composed players on the ball, players that can play football. They wasn't interested about winning the ball back. They're only interested in about what we're going to do when we get the ball. And that's their philosophy in Brazil. Different now, but back in those days, that's what Brazil were all about. I love the story about the white kit. You've got to tell me that. Yeah. And let's go back in time to 1950.
Yeah, you're very right. 1950 was the famous first post-World War World Cup, and it was held in Brazil. It's when the Maracanã was built for, and it's strange. It was the only World Cup where there wasn't a final, because there had 2 groups and then a group afterwards, and it just happened the last game was Brazil and Uruguay. And in those days, as you mentioned, Brazil basically wore all white, and that was their national strip colours. And they played Uruguay in the final. Everybody thought Brazil was going to win. It was cut and dry. They were home. They were the best team that skated through the group, scoring 5 goals, 6 goals, all this sort of thing. Whereas Uruguay sort of not struggled, but got through follows comfortably. And when Brazil scored to go ahead, the game was over apparently, but it wasn't. And a guy called Alfredo here equalised, who's famously said in an interview with the BBC, there's only 3 people ever quiet in the Maracanã, and that's Frank Sinatra, the Pope, and him. And then the winning goal was called by a guy called Ciafino, who actually went to an Italian club afterwards. And basically Uruguay beat them, and it was a really traumatic thing for Brazil. They'd sort of they'd almost won the tournament before they even started playing it. And because of that, the loss was even deeper. And Pelé said afterwards, it's the only time he saw his father cry. And interestingly, Zagallo, who was the coach in 1970, was a soldier in 1950, and he was on security duty at the Maracanã that day. And because it was such a traumatic experience, Brazil, the players said, we're never wearing all white again. And there's a newspaper, and I can't remember what it's called, it might be Clarion, I can't remember, who agreed that they would run a competition to design, people design the new strip. And it had to be taken from the colours of the Brazilian flag, which is green, blue and yellow. And there was a young, I think it was 18, 19-year-old kid who became quite famous afterwards. He designed the winning design for the Kiss Canario shirt, which is obviously so famous now. And interestingly, in the 1958 final, when they played Sweden, Brazil's kit was yellow and blue, as was Sweden's. So Brazil had to change. And the nominated second strip was this all white. The players refused point blank to wear it. So they had to send out a couple of the training staff to go into Stockholm and buy a set of blue shirts. but the Brazilian badges were sold afterwards just to avoid the players playing in all white. So it was a proper, they continued a massive curse because of what happened in the American Army in 1950.
And they're a very superstitious race, aren't they? They're a very religious
definitely.
race, and football is religion in Brazil. But it was an Englishman that took a football to Brazil, and they started kicking the ball around. Early doors in the World Cup, were they in the 1934 World Cup? They didn't do anything really before 50, did they? They really come to light in that World Cup in their own patch.
That's right. They were in 1930, 34, and 38 in France.
Yeah.
I think they lost in the semi-final to Hungary, off the top of my head. And when they had a guy called Leonidas, who was apparently has been widely reputed as being the guy who invented the overhead bicycle kick.
Leonidas da Silva. Yeah.
Leonidas, yeah.
Yeah. Apparently he is. I mean, if you talk to Doug Ellis, I mean, sadly Doug's passed now, but Peter With told me that it was Doug that invented the bicycle kick when he played for Southport. but apparently it was Da Silva.
I bet that's a story Doug used to tell well time and time again.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, that 1950, when you get awarded the World Cup, when you build such a phenomenal stadium that housed 200,000 fans, to get beat in your own yard by Uruguay must have been the most bitterest pill to swallow. But 8 years after, Brazil were the kings of the world. Let's talk about that 1958 World Cup triumph, because it wasn't just the great Pelé as a 17-year-old kid that scored a brace in the final, but there was another Brazilian there, arguably, and a lot of Brazilians would say was just as good as the great Edson Arantes de Nascimento. It was the little bird, Garrincha.
Well, yeah. I mean, Garrincha was such a star in those days.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, the guy who won the most valuable player award in that tournament wasn't Pelé, wasn't Garrincha. It was Didi.
Gotcha.
Who won and he actually, in 1970, he was coaching the Peru team that Brazil played in the quarterfinals. But Garrincha was an amazing player. I mean, you read so much about Garrincha. He was the guy who sort of epitomised Brazilian football. And you say quite rightly, Paul, this was a religion in football there, and it wasn't about winning. It was about being entertaining, showing what you do. So he beat a player, then go back and beat him again just because he could. And the important thing was doing that rather than making, scoring goals from there. But obviously, they still did progress. But Garrincha was a wonderful player in 58, 62. And interesting, between 62 and 66, the military dictatorship took over in Brazil. And income tax for Brazilian footballers tend to be a bit more theoretical than absolute in those days. And when the military junta took over, that changed. And a lot of players had to sort of pay lots of back taxes. And Zagallo, I remember, and I can't remember, there was a couple of players who virtually bankrupted themselves paying their back taxes. But Garrincha was a sort of hard-living guy who sort of spent what he had on drinks and women and whatever. And he could have basically implemented to pay his back taxes. And legend has it that João Havelange, who was in charge of Brazil FA at the time, paid Garrincha's back tax just to make sure he could go to the 1966 World Cup, because Havelange got in his mind, Brazil won 58, won 62. If they win 66, it'd be great for his run to win the FIFA presidency. So it was interesting that, legend has it that he basically paid a lot of money to get Garrincha to the 1966 World Cup, when basically his best days were well behind him. I mean, he was great in 58, as you say, and even in 62, when Pelé was injured, Garrincha was the star that stepped up into the and became the main man of that team. He
was one of the greatest wingers of all time. In 1970, they had another great winger, Jairzinho, that scored in every game that he played. But I just want to stay on the Garrincha theme for a bit. Yeah. He was an incredible personality, wasn't he? He was an alcoholic. I think he fathered about 20 kids. I mean, he was just a different kind of person. He would literally go back to his part of Brazil and play football with the kids just on the beaches. I mean, When you look at the professionalism of players now, don't drink, don't smoke, don't do all the right things. Garrincha was the complete polar opposite, wasn't he? He was a one-off.
Oh, definitely. Absolute maverick. He had this thing. If you look at pictures of him, his legs were slightly deformed as well.
Yeah, they were.
It's almost like he was sort of got like a bit of a wave in his legs as they go up. But it certainly didn't inhibit his play, as you say. He's an absolutely wonderful player. And I read his biography not too long ago, and he used to go back where he was born. There's a factory team he used to play for when he was starting off. And he'd go back and play for them, as you say. Go play. It didn't matter to him because he was just playing football, and that's all that mattered really to him. Other than the sort of, wine, women and song, as it were.
And he loved to shoot birds, didn't he? That's how we got the nickname. He liked to go shooting wrens, and that's why they called him Little Bird, for his love of shooting.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, yeah.
But what a player, what a team. So they've won the World Cup in 1958. They've gone down to the Swedish equivalent of JJB and got a load of shirts and sewn the badge on. 1962, 1966 in England. And that was a World Cup that many people have said Brazil were kicked out of the World Cup. But that's not strictly true, is it?
Well, no, it's certainly a factor, but, having looked at a lot of the players, and especially Pelé, says, that wasn't the main reason. In 62, after they won in 62, the Brazilian FA decided to send the team on a tour of, it was Europe and North Africa, and it took in Israel as well, I think, if memory serves me correctly. And they played a crazy schedule of about, and I'm not sure the exact figures are right now, but something in the region of about 25 games in 45 days or something. So basically it's travel, play, and it was all about brass. Now, the rationale that the Brazilian FA said was it was to give the team a chance to experience European conditions because the World Cup would be held in Europe in 66. And on the face of that makes sense, but it wasn't. It was all about basically raising money for the Brazilian FA, which they raised a lot of money of. And Brazilian FA to this day do the same thing, send the Brazil teams on tours around the world to raise money. But the other thing it did was it allowed European teams, European countries, to see Brazil play in the flesh and work out how they could beat them. Yeah. So that was the first thing that went wrong. The second thing is that they had they brought a coach back, Fiola, who'd won the trophy in 58. And basically this guy was quite old by this stage. And they had also appointed what they call a technical committee, which is basically 3 or 4 people from the Brazilian FA who were there to oversee what was going on. And I talked to Andrew Downey about this, and he said that before flying across to England for the tournament, they selected a squad of 46 players and basically set them on a tour around Brazil to the various regions of Brazil, where local dignitaries would pay the FA to have Brazil visit their region, their city, their town or whatever, and play against local teams again to raise money. So they did a lot of honour of Brazil before they even flew out. And obviously it was very disorganised, and Pelé says this with the preparation was terrible. And this obviously caused a lot of problems because they reckon, and then again, I haven't got the proof to say this, but legend has it, because there were so many players, they played lots of different teams, but the same 11 players never played twice. So, it's hardly the way to produce a settled side. So, yeah, that was another reason. So many things that went wrong. Fiola was quite old and wasn't very well. This technical committee kept interfering in there. And then, obviously, there was the brutality that the first the Bulgarians dished out to them, and then later the Portuguese in the final game. But they won the first game, and Pelé and Garrincha scored. It was the last time they played in the game together. Pelé was injured for the second game when they played Hungary and got beat. And they got to come back in the last game because they needed to win. And they made no less than 9 changes. Now, in a World Cup, if you've played your first two games and you qualified, or you played your first 2 games and you can't qualify, then quite often the coaches will give other squad members a chance. But this is a vital game. They've got to win by 3 goals, I think, to qualify. And they made 9 changes. So it was chaos. the organisation was all over the place, and to I think from what the players said, that was the reason they didn't get through, rather than the fact that there was a brutality being dished out by other teams.
Absolutely, completely disjointed, wasn't it? And a lack of organisation. Yeah, a bit of brutality as well, but the full picture is, as you've just put it there. Brazil, the book. Oh, Jogo Bonito. It's not just, as you say, about the 70s. It's about Brazil before and Brazil after 1974. Did you have many contributors to the book? You did with the Dutch one. You had Rudy Kroll, didn't you? But yeah. I'm guessing when you're looking at 50s and 60s and certainly the early 70s, there's not many still alive, is there, to tell the tales?
Dead right, Paul. So the short answer is no, I didn't really. You mentioned Andrew Downey, which I spoke to, a guy called Alex Bellos, who written about Brazil, football in Brazil, how it's important to lifestyle. And also a guy called Sam Conte, who brought a book out last year about Brazil in the World Cup. So I spoke to a few people who had this experience with players, and so yeah, it is really difficult because, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book and need to write it now, because in 10 years' time, nobody will be there.
And to listen to the rest of this podcast, head on over to www.patreon.com/SRB Media. Thank you.